Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa and welcome into the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host, back after a couple of weeks away on personal leave and a bit of sick leave. And Peter Bale, our co-host from Hoon Bay. Peter, how are you?
Bernard, it's very good to see you. I think you're in the Vero Centre, which is one of the ugliest buildings. It's the building with the uplifted toilet seat on the top, isn't it?
You're exactly right. It's like it's flipping up as we walk past it.
Yeah.
And you want to shout at the building, put your lid down. That's right.
Funnily enough, I was in an adjacent building for a meeting this morning and looking out of the window across at the SAP building, which is that big piece of glass building nearby, sort of bronze glass. And there were two or three men doing window cleaning. And it was one of the most sort of, I started to get vertigo just watching them. But anyway, but you come over to the city from the island, Bernard.
Yes, and I've missed my ferry to go back. So I am in the foyer. It's nice and quiet, bit of a different background. And it's amazing what you can do with a laptop, a microphone, and a good broadband connection, and touchwood will have
good. No, well, you look fine. It's actually a very stylish backdrop, and very clever of you to have your headphones and your mic with you. Have you been doing a public thing today?
Yeah. A chat with a few people, which was good, and I am over the hump of COVID, and feeling a lot better, which is great.
Yeah. And Bernard, do we tell people that you've been through, of course, one of the great rites of passages in life?
Yeah.
You lost your mother.
As I mentioned in explaining why we haven't had a podcast and some of the email newsletters, Lynn and I travelled to Australia just on 2 weeks ago now, and spent some time with my mum, who then passed away, and we had a funeral last Friday, and she was 90, and we had it was it was a good time actually for family to get together. When you get to this age, I'm 57 now, you build very full lives, and it's often quite hard to, particularly when people are living in different countries, to spend lots of time with your family at this time of life. And so this was a chance to do that, and it was a really
And Bernard,
time.
you had to do the eulogy, which is I was just talking to our producer Simon before, and I did both of my parents, and he did his mum because his father's still with us, but it's a very important piece of writing and a very important piece of editing that you've got to get right.
Yeah.
And you can be very proud to have done it, I think, by the way it sounded like it went.
Yeah, I enjoyed the sort of collaboration of it, working with my brothers. I've got three brothers in Australia, in Melbourne, in and around Melbourne, and we spent quite a bit of time editing. Lynn did an amazing job of editing the photos, and in a way it was a bit like rediscovering her own mum's life.
Yes.
Through collecting photos and crafting a narrative, a story of who she was and what she did, and it was a great time.
Good.
And I was so good to see everyone.
Good. Well, we got lots of messages on the YouTube from people, wishing you all the best. And
I was so thrilled and humbled, really, to see so many people respond to the emails and send so many good wishes. I'm sad I haven't been able to respond to everyone individually, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of those people who expressed their condolences, and I feel like there's a great community around the kaka, and it's a very supportive one, and
there is Bernard, and I think a huge 99.5% of that, 105% of that is you. because as I said to you when Simon was doing an application for us for a podcast award this week, I said, we can call Bernard not only respected but beloved, and you're a very authentic person, and our audience sees that. So let me tell, without you getting all weepy, because it could easily happen. The other one thing I want to mention, so you could say, Peter, what have you been working on lately?
Yes, so Peter, what have you been working on lately?
Excellent, Bernard. Well, funny you should ask that. So the next week's listener, which comes out, I believe, on Sunday, although subscribers will get it, if there are any subscribers still to it, we'll get it tomorrow, is a story that I really care about. I seem to write for the listener only things that I actually really care about, which is about the Paihiatua Polish kids who, it's the 80th anniversary of more than 700 of them coming to New Zealand at the invitation of Peter Fraser, the wartime Prime Minister. And in doing this, I interviewed last week or week before a 92-year-old veteran of the Paihiatua camps. And I learned so much from him, and he's such a lovely man. He's the father of a friend of mine, actually. And I learned so much, Bernard. There was 1 million people, Poles, more than 1 million, moved by Stalin, because if you remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he and Hitler divided up Poland initially in 1939. And it ended up with 13,000 of these kids in Iran. They walked more or less from Siberia to Uzbekistan, and then 13,000 of them were in Iran, in camps in Iran. Many of them died because they were already malnourished, and they went to places like Mexico, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, or what was then Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, India, and Mexico. And 700 of them, in fact more than 700, about nearly 800 of them came to New Zealand. And it's an extraordinary saga, and I hope people like it. Please take a look at the listener. And there's also a weird family connection, which I mentioned actually to the audience here a few months ago. But my grandmother is in the piece because she looked after the Paihiatua kids after 1944, amongst many others. But she and another woman in Palmerston North, Anne Jakes, set up a thing called the Polish Army League during the war, which ended up having 8,000 members around the country writing letters and sending parcels to Polish soldiers in the Middle East and Italy. And it was just an extraordinary phenomenon, really. And of course, I hadn't realised too, maybe you did, Bernard, that the Poles fought with the New Zealanders right through Tobruk, El Alamein, and Monte Cassino. Bernard, you've gone quiet for some reason. You're on mute, I think. Yes, you are.
And of course, we're heavily involved with the Royal Air Force.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, that's also, so my father flew with a lot of Poles in the Royal Air Force. But anyway, so here's Catherine. But let me just also let's give our audience a sense of what's coming up. We're going to devote quite a lot of today's session with Robert to international news with Robert Professor. We can't just call him Bobo. Can I call you Bobby, darling? Yeah, no. If you remember the Monty Python sketch. We're going to get a friend of mine, Elaine Monahan, on from Washington, D.C. to talk about the US election. I've asked her to talk about how it's going down so far, where the polls appear to be heading, and also to give us maybe a handful, maybe 5 things that New Zealand audiences, our audience, might like to look at, so that we don't just retread everything and do a horse race. But Elaine is a terrific person, and I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. So think about, if you want to put some questions on the YouTube chat, I'll relay them, because Bernard never looks at the YouTube chat, but that's fine. Catherine, how lovely to see you. Which city are you in today?
I'm still in Wellington.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's very gusty, windy out there, so you might hear a bit of
what
windows
an incredible
rattling.
surprise.
Yes. Wellington on a good day. Well, it's almost a good day, yes. Catherine, lovely to see you. Thank you very much. And we have more detail in the climate wrap, which will go out tomorrow. But just wanted to alert our listeners to a piece of research on the Atlantic currents and why it's important. Could you tell us a bit more about the AMOC and the risk of collapse?
Yeah, so the AMOC, or the Atlantic Meridional Overturning System, so it's an ocean circulation system. We've talked about this, I think, a few times in the past, where that system is in danger of collapsing, and that's because of all of the ice melt in the northern Atlantic, and that ice melt is not only very cold, but it's also not very salty, and so it disrupts the normal circulation systems of currents that move up and down latitudinally. And it affects quite a few countries if it does slow down. And so there have been a series of, it's known as a tipping point that could lead to a domino effect with other tipping points, so it's interrelated with other things that go on around the world. And there has been three or more actually pieces of research in the last year that are suggesting that the AMOG is weakening a lot and is threatening to switch off altogether. And in the IPCC reports, they've always kind of said, oh, this is a long-term risk, it's something that will happen after 2100. What's happened just in the last week is that a group of 44 experts from 15 countries around the world have put together a very stark warning letter for Nordic ministers. And they've sent this to them saying, we think the IPCC is underestimating the risk. There have been all of these reports coming out that suggest that it could collapse much earlier than expected. And in fact, one of the latest reports, it's still in preprint, but that is suggesting that there is a 59% chance, plus or minus 17, that it could collapse before 2050. And if it were to do that, it would make parts of Northern Europe much, much colder than they are currently. Mm-hmm. And that is a particular concern for Nordic countries. It is not the sort of thing that you could adapt to. The changes would happen over a decade to 15 years, but they could end up under a lot of ice, and it could shut down agriculture in northwestern Europe.
Oh, Jesus Christ, there won't be bloody ice. It's global warming, isn't it?
It would be warmer for us. So actually the other side of it is that it would get warmer, a little bit warmer for us, but a hell of a lot colder for them. And so they've put together this warning for Nordic ministers because they're saying this is really urgent, that you need to push for much stronger action in the short term in order to prevent this from happening, because it has such profound and meaningful impacts, particularly for your countries. So they're really trying to tip them into action by sending them this letter. It is a roll call of really influential climate scientists that have written this thing. So, you know, they're not playing around here. This is serious.
And Catherine, given that we're going to look at US politics through Elaine, and I hope you stay on or go into the background, but what are you thinking as a climate expert? I mean, climate hasn't actually Kamala Harris hasn't even raised it at all, as far as I can tell, in any public statements. And you've also got the situation where the United States is now the largest energy producer in the world, virtually all of it fossil fuels, which has happened under the Biden administration with fracking. This is not, there's no change of gears here from the big polluters other than China, right?
Yeah, it's worrying. Obviously, it's worrying particularly if Trump gets in. That's really scary from a climate point of view. But even in terms of the question of gas and fracking, that's another one of the stories actually that we have on the Climate Wrap this week, talking about gas actually being worse for the climate in the short term than burning coal, particularly the fracking version, the shale gas that they are exporting. 33% worse over a 20-year time frame than burning coal because of the amount of methane that is leaking in the process.
Because as you know, I've talked to you about, or sort of, asked you questions about, because I've swallowed the idea that gas is an excellent interim solution, but that's very interesting.
The big problem with with this report that's just come out recently, the the researcher is a guy called Robert Howarth. He first said this in a report some 13 years ago, and it just got buried by disinformation from oil and gas people. And so, that knowledge was around before the big shale gas boom in the US. So the amount of damage and addition to climate instability that has happened since we first knew this is enormous. It has landed us right at the foot of some new climate tipping points, and that could have been avoided if some more attention had been paid to his work 13 years ago.
Interesting whether we're at the foot of those tipping points or at the cliff edge of those tipping points. But
the precipice.
I guess it's one person's perspective. Catherine, thank you so much. We're going to move now, I think, to the US elections, and which look like they're going to be absolutely critical. And I'd like to introduce a lovely friend of mine and one of the great foreign correspondents I've ever worked with, Elaine Monaghan, who is now a professor of journalism at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. And Robert Patman is the professor of international affairs at Otago University. And Robert, on the way in, I was introducing you as to take from the Monty Python interview with, can I call you Bobby Darling? Yeah.
I've been called worse things.
Yes, I bet you have. But only by your students. So, Elaine, it's really super to have you on from Washington, D.C. This is Bernard Hickey, who I don't think you've met before, who's a lovely boy. And you know me all too well. But Bernard keeps going on to mute because he's working in a cafe at the moment.
Well, kia ora, Elaine. Thank you so much. We can, and it's fantastic to have you on. We really appreciate it.
So, Elaine, I gave you a bit of and I'd love, Robert is a terrific regular that we have. You can be a regular if you'd like to be, but you're staying up, of course, beyond midnight to do this. So I do appreciate that. I asked you whether you could give us a bit of an overview of where you think things are heading. I know where I think that they're heading, and it's making me incredibly nervous watching it. And I don't even live there, nor do I have a vote. Tell us, as a Washington expert and political expert, what do you think's where do we stand 10 days out?
I wish I could tell you a clear answer to that question.
Jesus, this is a podcast. You've got to be absolute. Nobody will remember.
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of interesting. I'm an unusual person in a way to answer this question. First of all, because I'm Scottish, but I've lived here for a long time. And I split my time between the Washington, D.C. area, which is very clearly Democratic territory, and Indiana, which is very clearly not. So it kind of depends which state I'm in when I have to answer this.
Well, that's
question.
Very good that you've got, unlike most people, you've got access to both points of view without having to go and interview people in a diner.
So exactly, and of course, you can choose your diner and get the answer to the questions that you want, rather like social media. You'll find what you look for. And I think, unfortunately, the simple truth is that the national polling tells us that the election has gotten only closer in the last couple of months. So that doesn't help us very much. And of course, you have to look at what's happening in the 7 swing states. Those are the places that
Can you recite what the 7 swing states are?
Well, I have written them down.
Oh, good. No, don't say that. No, just do it. Just give the impression you're doing it off the top of your bloody head.
Well, I can't do that, Peter. It's the Reuters.
No, you give the impression. Yeah. So just tell us what they are.
Well,
please.
So okay. So, I mean, all right, well, I'll talk about one that's really in my head today, which is in Nevada, because there's a very interesting development happening there around the incredibly high cost of housing and the effect that has had on voters in that state, who are an example of a population who are looking for answers to horrible questions that they're of life and death that are facing them, and of a reality where in the past they might have expected they could buy a home that they could live in. That reality is not one that many working people are able to attain now, and some of it is a post-pandemic problem where housing prices went through the roof because lots of people in California thought it would be a good idea to move there, where houses cost a lot less, and of course that had a huge impact on the cost of housing for people who were already there. So that's just a kind of a snapshot of one of the economic problems that are driving some of the decisions that people are making, because they're looking at a choice between somebody that they identify as a strong man who is a businessman, and they might not like the things that Trump says, they might not care about the things that he says, but when they think about their pocketbooks, in the end, that's what's driving their decision. And of course, there's another, sort of slightly more malignant problem, which is hard to, overlook as a woman, or as any human being,
Yes.
frankly, which is the enormous gender gap that we're seeing, which is opening up even more widely, and sort of
When you say gender gap, do you mean particularly around the issue of abortion, or?
Well, that's one of the issues, but it just generally in terms of people's willingness to accept Trump as a candidate. And one of the really abortion, absolutely, and reproductive rights is very much top of mind for a lot of people. But in the sort of the Gen Z population, 18 to 29-year-olds, as a colleague at the New York Times has been writing about last week, that group has seen an enormous surge in support among women for Harris and for the liberal position, which translates into support for Harris, and a much less sort of dramatic but nonetheless notable increase in support for Trump.
Amongst the men,
among the men in the same
people.
age, but particularly young men who don't have a college degree, which is a measure of the disappearance of manufacturing jobs, of manual labour jobs, which of course are being have moved overseas or are potentially being done by robots and will be more and more. And so for that group of young men, the sort of alienation that is associated with that has driven a certain shift towards Trump. Now, whether that translates into a more national picture, I mean, only time will really tell, sorry. But
okay, but so the 7 states we need to watch are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan,
Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. What have we missed?
North Carolina.
North Carolina, thank you. We said Nevada already.
Yeah.
Who have I missed? I think
Wisconsin. Did you say Wisconsin?
I think I said Wisconsin.
Excellent.
Already.
Good. Well, we got them there. So, what is there? I mean, I see Nate Silver, who is a bit legendary in this, and also Alan. So Nate Silver is saying he thinks Trump will win. As of now, and Alan Lichtman, the US historian who has had an incredible record of predicting it correctly, says he thinks Harris will win. What are you seeing? Is there some polling in those 7 states that you have found intriguing?
So, the national polls are showing a narrowing. The swing state polls are also not definitive. If anything, Trump has actually ticked up very slightly. So he has, the last I looked at, a 2-point lead in 2 of those swing states, which is still tiny. And the difference between the 2 candidates in the other states is less than 1 point.
Now, look, you let me just explain to people as well, and Robert will be fascinated by this. So Elaine is not only a journalist, but she was also the ambassadress to Poland, because her husband was the ambassador to Poland from the US when President Obama was in. Correct? It was Obama, wasn't it?
Correct. Yes.
So when you've lived in the States a long time, you've got American kids. Does it surprise you that virtually half the American population suggests that it's going to vote for a fascist felon, as Kamala Harris described him today?
I mean, yes. I mean, it's a hard reality to live in, that a man who has said the things he has said, who has talked about the enemy within and threatened to use military force against, Nancy Pelosi, is actually the person who has a, perhaps a 1 in 2 chance of becoming our next president. I mean, it was much more shocking, I suppose, last time, because I think we were all in a state of disbelief and nobody really, very few people were expecting him to win the last time. The fact that he did it once, of course, makes it seem much more likely that it will happen again. And I think the sort of the zeitgeist, the psychological analysis, I would say, is that, we're all telling ourselves, well, he could win, because we're preparing ourselves for that possibility.
Yes.
So yeah, but I
What
mean,
would you
of
s-
course,
what-
it's shocking. Yes.
What would you say then to a New Zealand audience, Elaine? Because you've got probably the a couple of hundred of the and tomorrow when we put out a podcast, thousands of the most clever people in New Zealand listening to Bernard and Peter's and Robert's podcast.
Pressure.
What would you say to them about how they should see this?
I mean, I think it's important to try to see it in a historical timeline, right? And that again is perhaps an act of self-preservation when I say that. I mean, I've been trying to look back in time and ask myself, well, what did he say and what did he do? What are the things that actually happened? And probably the most shocking event of all of the last few years was the January 6th insurrection. Yes. No question. And it's hard to say definitively that he caused that. I mean, it's hard to say that. But what we can say is that he didn't stop it when he had the opportunity. And I think that's the thing that for me is the most troubling, that is the litmus test that tells me that the people who are ringing alarm bells right now, we should listen to.
And also he does say what he's, I mean, the great thing about him, he doesn't hide it.
Well, yes, there's certainly no self censorship going on, and I don't know if your audience has been paying attention to this latest sort of horrible crude expression of his surprise at the Arnold Palmer.
Arnold Palmer's Willie.
Thank you
his
for saying
9
that.
iron.
So I
he had a
didn't
9-inch
have to.
9 iron, I think. Yeah.
Which brings us on to another subject that Peter, you and I care about a lot, which is the media coverage of this. I mean, because in my head, I'm like, for God's sake, let's just not cover this. It's ridiculous. We should spend zero time talking about this topic. And on the other hand, do we ignore it? I mean, can we ignore it?
You can't ignore it.
Right. So I mean, at this, but Jon Stewart, I don't know whether your audience can ever see Jon Stewart, the comedian. Can. So sometimes you have to just watch Jon Stewart on a Monday night in order to know what to think about all of these things. And this week he was drawing a parallel between this Arnold Palmer story and the Enemy Within story and kind of scratching his head and saying, well, why are we not talking about that? And of course we are, but we're also talking about the Arnold Palmer story.
Yeah. Bernard's just itching to ask you a question. Sorry. And you've got to turn your mic on, Bernard.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Elaine, for these insights. And maybe I'm just grasping desperately for straws, but is it possible that a much higher turnout on enthusiasm for Harris means that the polls, which make assumptions about turnout and correct for various over indexing of certain groups, that the polls could be wrong?
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I think that's the case is that when you look at the margin of votes with which Biden won swing states last time, you're talking about a few thousand. And so absolutely. So even just that population of Generation Z women who have swung so much more liberal and are in a group that tends to vote less, if lots of them turn out that we're not counting on, that could have an effect. Yes, absolutely.
And Elaine, you're something of a foreign policy expert. I mean, Robert, Elaine has been the Reuters correspondent in Kiev, Moscow, Washington, and also the Ireland bureau chief for a while in Dublin. What's your perspective, particularly for our neck of the woods, on, well, also including Ukraine, on where foreign policy might go under Trump?
That's a very big question. I mean, obviously the Ukraine story is the one I've sort of been thinking about the most recently, and that affects us all because obviously that's a global threat, and it certainly doesn't. I mean, it looks as if Zelensky needs to assume he's going to have less support if Trump wins militarily. So what will that mean for other partners? I mean, other people will presumably have to step into the brink more. So that's one big issue that, and obviously then, his tariff policies around China and so on are obviously going to have an enormous effect potentially. But generally, this kind of stepping away from a multipolar view of the world, there certainly hasn't been any indication that that's going to get any less extreme than it was if he's elected.
Who would his Who would his Secretary of State be? Do you think?
Oh gosh,
Nikki Haley.
Well,
no, Jared Kushner. I'm sorry, I just realised who it's actually going to be. Jared Kushner. Robert, let me bring you in this. I forgive me for sort of pushing you back into
No, I've been listening to Elaine's contribution.
Elaine is a terrific person, but in New Zealand, of course, we think about AUKUS. Our government is hesitating, or is essentially waiting, taking a sort of long game about AUKUS, the defence arrangement. What do you think about what you've heard from Elaine and this area that she just mentioned about multilateralism, which is one of your big hobby horses, as it were?
I agree with everything Elaine said, and the thing that I would, quick question for Elaine when she gets a chance to respond shortly. There's been a number of very prominent Republicans, of course, who've come out against Trump, and sometimes that takes a while to make itself manifest itself in the polls. There's a lot of pressure now on George W. Bush to make clear where he stands, and Liz Cheney. But, we shouldn't go. I know social media is not always that representative, but there does seem to be a number of prominent Republicans now really distancing themselves from Trump and coming out and saying that they support the Constitution and not the Republican Party as led by Donald Trump. So I'd be interested in your take on that. With regard to Peter's point about AUKUS, and I think, and I wrote a piece which I think Peter and Bernard are aware of recently, when I said it's an irony that we have a right of centre government which actually needs a Kamala Harris presidency in order to pursue its foreign policy that it wants. That is to say, if Mr. Trump comes to power, it will be incredibly difficult, and the difficulty won't be confined to New Zealand. It'll be very difficult for New Zealand to participate in AUKUS in any shape or form if Mr. Trump becomes president.
Even politically,
I was in Australia last year, and the Australians told me they would. Some Australians, off the record, from the military, said they felt there would be pressure to leave AUKUS if Mr. Trump becomes president, because they simply, they're largely financing AUKUS, this sort of enhanced security partnership to deter China. But they said it's another thing when you're putting in a lot of money when you've got someone they think is reasonably sensible in the White House. Mr. Trump, with his view that America first, and he only likes multilateralism if it works for the United States.
If it's unilateral, yeah.
Yeah. And that goes down like a lead balloon with many of America's allies, of course. So, there's been no indication that Mr. Trump has changed his basic view that American foreign policy is all about ensuring American primacy and creating a sort of top-down international order, a sort of free-for-all where international institutions are weakened. They're seen as a constraint on American power.
Yeah.
And the middle powers and the small powers can basically look after themselves. This seems to be the Trump vision. He seems to relish in his good relations with Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping, because I think he believes the world should be run by great powers. And since America's the greatest of all...
And great men.
That works out very nicely, thank you. That seems to be his approach. I'd be interested in Elaine's comments on, her view on this.
But Bernard's absolutely busting to come in before Elaine comes in. Go on.
I think Robert's onto a really important point here, which is that Trump will, for example, on trade, say we give nothing to these potential AUKUS partners. We don't do a free trade deal with New Zealand or any sort of free trade deal. And the Australians, they can pay for all of the submarines and we won't give them to them. We will keep the submarine for ourselves.
Yeah, and we want bases, for our submarines there.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to argue to the Australian public in Australia or the New Zealand public in New Zealand that AUKUS with Trump is a good idea, you're going to really struggle because you've got nothing on trade And also, Trump's going to make you pay for everything double.
Elaine, do come in.
Sorry, I was just trying to find
Yeah, I
the
know. It's all right.
unmute button.
That's why we have a
So
producer.
I've forgotten what my question was now from
From Robert.
Robert. But it was
The question was is twofold, really. Basically, I was very interested in your take on these prominent Republicans like Liz Cheney.
right, yeah.
Do you think this will have an effect in the closing stages of the campaign race? And the second one, do you see any evidence that Mr. Trump may be more pragmatic than he suggests when it comes to foreign policy? And I think you've
Right.
already hinted you've seen no such evidence.
Well, he's certainly not talking like that. But I mean, that's complicated because there are some areas where he fudges things a little. I think inevitably he will have to, because if he were to become president again, reality changes people's behavior. Like, he can't stick with all of the rhetorical things he's said. It's very hard to imagine that he would. As far as I was trying to think of things that could actually affect the direction of things over the next few days, and there aren't many things. But one of them could be Republicans endorsing Harris. And in fact, I was trying to find the mayor's name, but there was a mayor, I think it was in Wisconsin, who's a Republican just maybe yesterday, who endorsed Harris. So those kinds of things can have an effect at a local level, certainly. It's hard to know how the Liz Cheney thing has changed things, because of course she's so associated with the Iraq invasion. So for me, the fact that she's come out and support in opposition to Trump is an absolute revelation. But I don't know how much ordinary American voters are really focused on that. So I think it's, they have other concerns. Otherwise, he wouldn't be in the position that he's in now.
Elaine, who could possibly, we talk about swing voters as well. Who could possibly not be already decided on this?
So I think, look, it's hard to know. I don't know a lot of undecided voters, probably. I don't know any personally. But it seems to be people are looking for reasons to vote for Harris because she's not fully, they feel like they don't really know who she is yet. So I can imagine she could say things that would clarify economic questions and tax questions and, kind of bread and butter things that could persuade some people. In the case of Trump, it's hard for me to picture how anyone is going to change their minds about voting or not voting for him. Like, it's much more a question of might they jump over to the side of the fence.
Did you see the story that's come out just today, in fact, of the woman who claims that she was groped by him? She was appearing in a sort of women survivors for Harris thing, and again it was one of those meetings with Epstein where Trump allegedly molested this woman. I mean, does that have any impact? That kind of, if the Access Hollywood tape doesn't cut it, is that going to cut it anyway?
Sadly, that has always been my view. If what he said about women in the Access Hollywood tape wasn't a deal breaker, then I've got nothing.
Yeah. And Elaine, just one other thing on the sort of climate, and I will bring Robert back on this. I was listening to somebody the other day talking about the US has the lowest unemployment now since 1968. It's the greatest energy producer in the world right now. It can't get enough people to do jobs. As The Economist said last week, it's got the economy of the envy of the world. That doesn't seem to be being felt by Americans, or at least they're somehow susceptible to this message that things are actually terrible. And
I think for some people things are really hard. I think grocery prices are really high, and housing costs really are beyond reach for a lot of people.
Yeah, mind you. Okay, let me just, because I was looking on Twitter the other day, and James Surowiecki, who wrote the very good book The Wisdom of the Crowds, was saying, this is just great. I've just filled up my car and it cost me $2.97 a gallon. And I thought, Jesus Christ, I've just filled up my Mini and it cost $2.97 a litre. 4.25 times as much. So, I mean, Americans really need to start sucking on different Saveloy. Now, day after. So imagine Harris squeaks through because there are enough people to who see sense in this somehow. And everything just goes away, right? Trump goes away. There's no worry about Dominion voting machines. There's no, we just say, oh yeah, fair. Is that how it's going to go?
No. I can certainly give you a clear answer to that question. And I am quite certain that that will not happen. And that we will probably have some kind of long, excruciating, horrible series of court battles that will give me complete PTSD reminder of how it was during the hanging Chad election, lost by Al Gore, only worse. So,
and you've got a very different Supreme Court.
We certainly do. So it's actually quite bone chilling to think about what could happen. And of course, there's the possibility of violence because we had that last time, and it could happen on a bigger scale. So.
Right, we're going to move to a slightly different topic, but keep you on if you don't mind, because you're
Please.
a wonderful international correspondent. But somebody asked, Artie Farty 87, who's one of our chattiest people, says, "Will you leave? Would you leave the United States if there was 4 years of Trump?"
No, I would not. My children are American. My husband is American. I live here despite the accent. I'm also half American. So no, I wouldn't.
Well, the other thing is though, but Artie, and you already know this from me, but Artie Farty 87 also says you can come. You're very welcome to come to New Zealand.
Thank
So
you.
I'm broadcasting with Bernard from my spare room, which as my daughter refused to come and stay in it because she said it's full of my shit. But I will clear my shit if you and Lee have to come.
Well,
now,
yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, the other story I wanted to keep you on for and also talk to Robert about is this all right, Bernard, to move to the other subject?
Yep.
Is Israel. So, Robert, you must be quite, given your focus on the international rule of law, you must be quite interested in the Israeli attempts to tell UNIFIL where to go, declaring the United Nations Secretary General persona non grata. Oh, and by the way, invading a sovereign country to its north. WTF,
Yes,
Robert?
very troubling developments, and America's silence is also very troubling. After all, the US was a key architect in the establishment of what we call the international rules-based order, an order based on institutions and the rule of law, at least in theory. And, we've been talking about the election. These two topics are kind of linked, Gaza and the situation in the Middle East and the election, because one of the things I'm very concerned about is that many people may either vote for the Green leader, Stein, or express their dissatisfaction with the Biden administration and take it out on Kamala Harris, who's part of the administration, of course. And I also understand Harris's dilemma. She, as vice president, someone part of the team, she can't really indicate she wants to take a different policy until she's actually been through hopefully won from her point of view. But I do find it very troubling what's happening, because one of the things that worried me for a long time about the Biden administration has been the fact that it seems it's actually facing a moral crisis in its foreign policy. This is a foreign policy that is supposed to embrace rights for all human beings that are universal. And yet the United States seems to be almost impervious, despite rhetorical expressions of concern, to the plight of innocent Palestinians. And that, unfortunately, is going to result in serious security consequences in the not too distant future. And the other thing that really worries me about what's happened with respect to the erosion of the rule of law has been the silence of many of America's close liberal democratic allies. We all know that the United States has a domestic politics problem in trying to be even-handed when there's a dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. But the United States keeps saying it wants a two-state solution, but at the same time it's arming someone who has steadfastly refused to even entertain that possibility in any shape or form.
But Robert,
And
let me ask
yeah.
you as well, just looking at Lebanon for a minute. Is this a war against Lebanon or a war against Hezbollah?
Sorry, you want me to respond to that, Peter?
Yeah. I mean, I know it's a fairly gigantic question, but
It rhetorically, it's a war against Hezbollah, but the problem is there does seem to be, like Gaza, collective punishment for the Lebanese, because as in Gaza, there's not being a really tight distinction. All counter-terrorist experts say one of the keys to being successful, if you're trying to target terrorist groups, and military people say this all the time, and this is why the IDF behaviour is so troubling in many respects, is to make sure you do not kill or try to minimise the amount of killing of innocent people. And unfortunately, that didn't happen in Gaza, where you had more than 16,000 children killed since the 7th of October. In the words of Matthew Miller, they are by definition not members of Hamas and not terrorists. That's very troubling. Particularly since 4/5 of the munitions were provided by the United States. And the second thing is that we have a situation where Mr. Netanyahu seems to be defying the United States. I think the United States has been diminished in the last 12 months because in the views of many people outside the United States, perhaps not within it, America is not acting like a superpower. After all, Mr. Biden did definitively say, with respect to Rafah, there's a red line there.
Yep.
Don't cross it. And yet, Mr. Netanyahu says, basically, you may think that, but I've got other plans. And he does go ahead with his other plans.
Yeah, and of course the discovery of Yahya Sinwar there was kind of a validation of the Israeli position because he was found in Rafah. Elaine, what do you make of the implications of this, and please be relatively brief in this case, but because the implications of this from a foreign policy point of view, the US being given the runaround.
Yeah, I mean, I think this point about the diminution of America's standing when it doesn't appear to be able to influence events there is very sort of stark. I mean, I will say that I think the election clearly is having an effect. In Michigan, 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the primary.
Oh, wow.
That was in the primary, so I mean that could affect the outcome of the election in Michigan, which could in turn affect the outcome of the entire election. It's not impossible. So, perhaps.
And what about this? So this week there's been an extraordinary set of leaks which appeared on Telegram and then were distributed on Substack, or very well covered on Substack, of US intelligence reports about the movement of Israeli air-launched ballistic missiles, which were non-nuclear, but also movement of nuclear-tipped missiles, which, of course, is one of those things that suddenly confirms what everybody knew. I don't think I knew that the Israeli nuclear device was called Jericho, Jericho 2 and Jericho 3, I believe it is. But what do you make of that, Elaine? This leak and the lack of reporting it until they started reporting the leak rather than what the leak said.
So, coverage of the Middle East in this country is incredibly complicated, and it tends to skew one way or another depending where you're looking. And I think people are quite paranoid about covering leaks and afraid of stepping on rules about covering stuff that they're not meant to be covering. And I think that's probably partly anyway what was driving that approach, was kind of anxiety about, coming out and a bit of self-censorship probably.
Yeah, interesting. Very. I mean, see this. You see what you've done there? You've dovetailed your role as a professor of journalism with your book about the CIA and your experience. Robert, do you want to say anything further? Because we should probably move to domestic New Zealand politics and worry about people getting completely pissed and then being a prick to other people.
The only thing I would add is that I think, as well as eroding the rule of law, which is not in America's interest globally, the Biden stance towards bolstered the very forces, the authoritarian forces, that the United States perceives as adversaries: China, Russia, and Iran. Iran is actually, from their point of view, America's one-sided approach to this issue has basically played into their hands, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal of awareness of the strategic ramifications of what's happening. And never again can the United States really take to task other countries for not adhering to the rule of law. In the global south, the United States stance has been seen as one of huge hypocrisy. And it's very worrying. I think I don't just blame the Biden administration. Two things that worry me more is the reticence of liberal democracies to speak up and ask the Biden administration to think again about their policy. That should have happened within a month. And secondly, the complexity of the UN Security Council. And that problem's got to be rectified. We can't go on and have a situation where one country can exercise the veto and effectively block what the rest of the world want, which is a ceasefire. And that should have happened on the 27th of October.
All right, we'll have you and Helen Clark on again. All right.
Sorry.
Not at all. No. It's very good.
Just one final
Bernard,
question for me to Elaine, as someone who's there in the United States. What are people thinking will happen in the first days of a Trump administration if he wins and it's a clear win? Because the last time he got in, the borders seemed to almost freeze immediately, with people worried about, not being able to get in or get out. And of course, there was that anti-Muslim order from the White House on the first day or so. What are people worried will happen in those first few days once Trump is sworn in, if he wins?
Well, certainly the retaliation question is top of mind for a lot of people. Am I going to be on the list of people that he's going to target? That's obviously in people's heads. And I mean, to your point, I think a lot, to the question from the audience member, I suspect a lot of people will start to think about leaving. So maybe there'll be an outward migration instead of an inward one. So yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of concern and anxiety, I think is probably the correct way to frame it. I did have to say something to this question about the United States. I mean, maybe I'm just old and cynical, but is it really the case that the United States has always stood up for walked the walk, or walked its talk, or whatever the right expression is, when it comes to adhering to, international rules? Because I don't feel that happened during the Iraq invasion. That was not
absolutely.
that long ago. So I don't know.
That's possibly why we haven't heard anything from George W. Bush.
But the US did pay a big price for the invasion of Iraq. I remember a Reagan advisor, William Odom, describing it as the greatest political and strategic disaster.
Well, the
in US foreign
Iraqis,
policy.
the Iraqis
And the fallout
paid,
from that has been considerable.
yeah, the Iraqis paid a much bigger price in terms
Oh,
of
yeah.
civilian, killing. So, I mean, it was a different kind of war, obviously. But the impact for Iraqis was absolutely
People are really
awful.
appreciating you saying that, Elaine, and sort of nodding sagely. And someone has said that they've heard that George Conway has said he'll move to New Zealand, which he might have to actually.
He can have
I'm
your
not.
basement.
I'm
then,
not putting
sir.
George. I'm not putting George Conway up in my spare room. Or he doesn't look very tall.
Hasn't Peter Thiel got a place over here as well?
Oh, he does. He does actually in Queenstown. Yes. Now look, thank you both very much. Now, Elaine, I think you're setting yourself up also to be the our commentator when the election happens. So stand by for another email from me. And
I'd be
thank you so much.
delighted.
Oh,
It was
thanks
very
very
nice
much.
to hang out
And
with
thanks
you
as
guys.
always,
Thank you,
Robin.
Elaine. Thank you.
Okay,
Cheers.
bye.
Bye.
So, Peter, that was a cracking show around the world with just a few minutes left, and understandably, to look at the domestic stuff. I'm after however many years, 8 years of thinking about Trump, wondering, worrying. In the last couple of years, I've taken this stance of just sort of like ignoring him, hoping he'll go away.
Yeah.
And trying to avoid.
Which is a good way to stay sane.
Yeah, I like that. But we're back at that point again where you just can't ignore it.
No.
And it's like, it is really like watching a car crash in slow motion. You just can't tear your eyes off it.
Yeah, well, I have to admit that I realized the other day, partly because I've got a new Apple Watch to check out my sleep apnea and my heart rate. I'm pretty sure my blood pressure, well, it hasn't actually, but I'm pretty sure I feel as though my blood pressure has gone up because I am genuinely anxious about this. And I'm anxious about the spread of bullshit and the preparedness of people to just buy into complete bollocks and and ignore bollocks as well. You know, they're buying into. And I worry very much when I see, and I still spend too much time on X with, I think the influence of Elon Musk and that crypto bro group is incredibly pernicious.
And Peter Thiel, a New Zealand citizen, is a major player in this. He is essentially the mentor for J.D. Vance. He's obviously provided a huge amount of funding for Trump and was one of the PayPal mafia alongside Elon Musk.
Yeah, well, he also is, of course, J.D. Vance's greatest backer.
Exactly,
and J.D. Vance is one hamburger away from the presidency.
One hamburger, or a big chunk of carrot if he ever ate vegetables.
Carrot? No, he doesn't eat vegetables. You know what I mean? Well, don't forget though, Bernard, that he doesn't do any exercise because he thinks that the body is a battery, and that if you do exercise, it just kind of runs out of your electricity. I mean, we're going to have to go through all this shit again if we're not careful. So, regardless of whether we think that that Harris is competent or not, the alternative is too dramatic. So, shall I do you want to have a quick word about New Zealand politics?
Just a brief one to say that this week we saw the government under pressure in Parliament in a sustained way for the first time, I think, for multiple days upon days, largely because of the Andrew Bailey, loser thing, which...
I was trying to work out how you do an election.
Yeah,
loser. Why don't you just fuck off and get it? I mean, Jesus, he must have been... Well, anyway, that would be defamatory possibly if I said that he was this.
Yeah, it's one of those awkward stories where Christopher Luxon has done what he's done in all of these cases, which is back his MP and not get rid of them. We've seen, a growing number of cases now, particularly with the coalition partners in cabinet, the ministers, McKee as the main one, but of course there's also Costello, where clear incompetence and
corruption.
Contempt.
Corruption you're working... Yeah. Contempt. The other C word, yeah.
Contempt for the usual processes of how cabinet works and how the laws work and how we make laws and how we have democracy. It's starting to wear on Luxon, and I thought it was interesting in yesterday's question time coverage to watch his body language when the questions about Bailey came up again. The frustration, the anger, why do I have to listen to these questions from these numpties? This is a waste of my time. I've got to get back to the 9th floor and start governing again. And
get my KPIs out. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that we're still 2 years out from an election, and the polls are actually showing that there's a good lead for the opposition, for the government over the opposition. But you can sense the frustration, and you can sense the Prime Minister's almost relief when he jumps off onto a plane for another trip, which he's just done.
As he should do. But can we also, from a media point of view, agree that this is a bullshit story, except that the reason it keeps going on is that it will eventually be found out that his story is not entirely robust. Is that right? That's what's happening, isn't it?
But what I think's happened in the last year is that we've had so many of these, storms and teacups, and it's now a really big pile of teacups, and people are going, gee, look at that big pile of teacups.
Yeah.
It's suddenly not just teacups anymore. It's a whole mountain of crockery, and people start to see trends. You know, when it's more than two things, then it becomes a trend.
That's a metaphor too far, Bernard, the cutlery. Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
oh, and then we're going to get a bull in a china shop. He's going to smash all the cutlery and the cups.
Yeah.
Now, shall I give you my skateboarding dog?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So you know, we talk about Florida man. You know, Florida man eaten by own pet alligator, or Florida man eats own alligator, or whatever it is. This is an Arizona man story, which is a man accidentally shot himself in the groin while inside a Buckeye Walmart on Tuesday. The man was in a Walmart store when the semi-automatic handgun began to slip as he carried it unholstered in the waistband of his sweatpants. The man told police that when he tried to reposition his loaded gun and keep it from falling, he shot himself in the groin. The other nice aspect of this, it was in the meat department of Walmart.
No.
Yeah.
No. And at least he wasn't going into the gun section of the Walmart.
Yeah. Well, he probably would have been
To buy
shot by
another
another
gun.
Walmart person.
Yeah.
But anyway. Bernard, thank you so much for this. And it'll be good to get some feedback maybe through the Kaka about, because I sent you a note about what I think we should do about the US election on our next, it'll be two away, won't it? It'll be two away. Be interesting to know what people want, because I don't think we want to do the horse race, but we could certainly get Elaine on again to talk about it at length on Thursday the 6th.
Yeah. I mean, it's just too big to ignore apart from anything else.
Yeah.
And New Zealand, I think the stakes are higher this time because of our dalliance with AUKUS 2 and simply because January 6th changed the equation so much around the world.
Good. Well, please let us know through notes to Bernard what you think you might want, and we'll try to supply it. Because I was thinking about whether we needed to do one on the election day, but it's actually our one on the 6th could be a chance to take a draw of breath.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone.
No, thank you, Bernard, and thanks, Simon, as always, for producing it.
And to Elaine
and to the audience,
Catherine and Robert for coming on. Wonderful to see you all. We'll see you all next week.
Thanks
I'm
very
not
much.
getting COVID in the next 5 days again. And we'll see you all next week on the Hoon. Ka kite anō.
See you, Bernard. Bye.
Hi, Simon. 9% uploaded. That's not much, is it? I better stay on.